The first time Ethan Marlowe heard the phrase, "the quiet ones," he thought it was just another local ghost rumor. One of those strange, backwoods legends people in rural towns told kids to keep them from wandering into old barns or abandoned farmland. But nothing about Hollow Creek, the small American town he had moved to 3 months ago, ever felt like a normal place for urban legends. The silence here had weight, like something that pressed against your skin. Even the forests that surrounded the town seemed to lean inwards, always listening, always waiting. Ethan had moved from Chicago to Hollow Creek to finish his graduate research in anthropology. His thesis was supposed to explore isolated communities and generational folklore. The reality of being in Hollow Creek, however, was far from the peaceful academic retreat he imagined. He had rented an old two-story farmhouse on the outer edge of town, near miles of thick woodland, where the trees grew so tall and dense that daylight often seemed dimmer than it should. The house had been empty for years, though the landlord cheerfully insisted it was just an old place needing a bit of love. The pipes groaned, the walls sighed at night, and the wooden floors carried that hollow, unsettled creak no matter how slowly he walked. But none of that bothered Ethan. He had lived in worse places. What bothered him were the people. They weren't unfriendly, not exactly, but there was something deeply restrained about the residents of Hollow Creek. Conversations always felt interrupted, like everyone here was holding back the second half of their sentences. They smiled too politely, they asked too few questions, and every one of them, without exception, avoided the woods after dark. At first, Ethan assumed it was a cultural thing. Small-town people often had their own customs, their own boundaries. But then, one day at the Hollow Creek Public Library, he asked the librarian, Mrs. Talbot, about any local stories or folklore he might read up on. She stiffened instantly. Her eyes flicked toward the back windows, the ones facing the line of pines that bordered the town. And then she said quietly, "We don't speak about the quiet ones around here, Mr. Marlowe. Best you don't either." The phrase lingered in his head for days after that, even though she refused to clarify her meaning. He tried asking others, at the diner, at the tiny hardware store, even the old man who owned the gas station, but they all responded with the same silence, the same stiff look, the same reflexive glance toward the trees. The woods surrounded Hollow Creek on 3 sides, an endless stretch of pine, oak, and undergrowth that seemed too thick for wildlife to move through comfortably. Yet sometimes, while sitting on his back porch at dusk, Ethan heard soft movements between the trees, slow, deliberate, not like animals, but not quite human either. On the nights he worked late at his desk, he could sometimes see faint shapes between the tree line, as though figures were standing motionless in the dark, watching the house without moving closer. He told himself it was just shadows, just the paranoia of a new environment, just stress. But even he didn't fully believe himself. His research was suffering, his sleep schedule was a mess, and the feeling of being watched, subtle but constant, gnawed at him every waking hour. The turning point came one rainy evening in October when Ethan found an old water-damaged notebook wedged behind a loose plank in the farmhouse attic. The attic smelled of damp wood and cold air, but what bothered him most was how strangely quiet the rain became as soon as he stepped inside, as though the attic swallowed sound. The notebook was wrapped in a piece of torn canvas and tied with brittle string, the kind that disintegrates when you try to untie it. Inside were pages full of messy handwriting, sketches of faces half hidden in dark smudges, and repeated phrases scrawled in the margins. They watch from the trees. They wait in the silence. They follow the quietest voice. The final pages became frantic, words scratched over other words, jagged lines cutting through sentences. One entry stood out more than the rest. "If you hear them whisper your name, it is already too late. They don't come for the loud, only the ones who fall quiet." The notebook belonged to someone named Daniel Hargrove. Ethan didn't recognize the name, but a date on the inside cover, 1989, suggested whoever Daniel was, he had lived in the house decades ago. A chill took root under Ethan's skin. The attic suddenly felt colder, the dark corners seeming to thicken. He left the notebook and climbed down in a rush, his breathing shallow by the time he reached the kitchen. He wasn't normally the type to scare easily, but the more he tried to write off the diary as the ramblings of an unstable mind, the more the entries clawed at him. That same night, he emailed his advisor, explaining he'd discovered material worth exploring and planned to investigate the town's folklore in more depth. But he didn't mention the shapes outside his window, or the silence of the attic, or the feeling, growing stronger, that something unseen had begun to pay attention to him. 2 days later, Hollow Creek held its annual Autumn Market Day, a cheerful event full of handmade crafts, apple cider stalls, and children running around with pumpkins painted on their cheeks. It was the first time Ethan saw the townspeople looking normal, relaxed, almost happy. He took photos, took notes, even interviewed a few vendors. Not a single one mentioned anything supernatural. But every now and then, someone would glance toward the woods, even in the middle of lively conversation, as though checking to see whether something or someone stood there. By late afternoon, clouds gathered, and an early dusk settled in. The event began to close, and Ethan offered to help the oldest vendor pack up her booth. She introduced herself as May Hargrove. His heart skipped. Hargrove? Like Daniel Hargrove? She froze instantly. Her eyes sharpened, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Where did you hear that name?" He told her about the notebook. She grabbed his arm, harder than he expected from someone her age, and hissed, "You shouldn't have touched anything that belonged in that attic." Ethan tried to protest, but she shook her head violently. "They come for those who look. They come for those who listen." With trembling hands, she pulled a small wooden charm from her coat pocket, a symbol carved into the shape of an eye with a slit through it. She forced it into his palm. "Keep this on you. Don't let the woods go quiet when you're alone." Before he could ask anything else, she hurried away at a near run, disappearing into the thinning crowd. On the walk home, the charm felt hot in his pocket, pulsing slightly like a heartbeat, even though he knew that was impossible. By the time he reached the farmhouse, night had swallowed the landscape. The wind moved strangely through the trees, rhythmic, almost patterned, like breath. The house stood silent, all the windows reflecting only darkness. When he stepped inside, the air felt wrong, heavy, still. He locked the door more out of instinct than caution. As he walked toward the living room, he noticed the lamp flicker, not like a bulb dying, but like something passing in front of the light source. The floorboard creaked behind him. He spun, expecting to see a person. Nothing. The kitchen doorway was pitch black. The shadows looked too deep, too still. And then he heard it, so faint he almost thought it was his own mind. "Ethan." A whisper, soft, thin, coming from the direction of the attic. Every hair on his body lifted. The sound was wrong. It didn't echo. It didn't travel. It just appeared in his skull, gentle as breath, but cold as winter air. The house went silent, completely silent. Even the wind outside stopped. The charm in his pocket burned hot. Ethan backed away from the attic stairs as the whisper came again. "Ethan, come see." Something moved at the top of the staircase, not fully visible, only the faint outline of a person. Tall, thin, unmoving, watching. He reached for the front door, but it wouldn't open, the lock jammed, the knob refusing to turn. His breath became shallow. The outline on the staircase leaned forward, not stepping, not walking, just bending in an unnatural angle, like its spine had too many joints. Ethan grabbed his bag, tore out the back door, and didn't stop running until he reached the middle of the field behind the house. Only when he collapsed on the grass did he realize the charm had grown cold again. The woods were silent, too silent. A shape, tall, thin, unmoving, stood between the trees, just barely visible, watching him from a distance, not approaching, just waiting. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He kept every light on, his back against the wall, staring out the window as dark figures occasionally appeared in the tree line, only to fade when he blinked. By morning, they were gone. Hollow Creek looked normal again. Birds chirped, cars passed on the road,
but nothing felt normal anymore. When he visited the library the next day, Mrs. Talbot refused to look at him. She simply whispered, "They've taken notice of you," and she quickly walked away. Ethan knew then that the diary wasn't a relic of one man's madness. Hollow Creek wasn't a quiet town with a silly superstition. Something lived in the woods, something that watched, something that whispered. And worst of all, whatever they were getting closer.
Ethan barely slept after the night he heard the whisper on the stairs. Instead, he sat awake until dawn with every light on, refusing to let silence creep into the house again. The next morning, driven by dread and desperation, he went straight to May Hargrove's small blue house. The old woman answered the door looking pale, her eyes sinking into worry the moment she saw him. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "They'll follow." But she let him in, closing the curtains as though sunlight couldn't protect them. Ethan told her everything about the figure on the stairs, the whisper calling his name, the silence that swallowed the house in the middle of the night. May listened without interrupting, her hands gripping one another like she was afraid they'd shake apart. When he finished, she finally said, "You've heard them, truly heard them. Then you're marked." She explained, slowly, painfully, that the quiet ones weren't ghosts, nor demons, nor anything human. They were ancient things that lived in the stillness of the woods, creatures that only moved when the world went silent, feeding on quiet the way fire feeds on air. They didn't chase the loud, she told him. They waited for those who grew curious, those who listened too closely, those who stayed still too long. And the moment someone noticed them, they never stopped watching, May said. Her voice trembled as she told him about her brother Daniel, the writer of the attic diary, how he had studied the quiet ones just as Ethan was now. He had heard the whispers too. He had tried to record them, and one night he entered the forest with a tape recorder and never came back. Only the recorder was found, filled with static and Daniel's fading breaths. "He went quiet," she whispered, "and they took him." Ethan felt the room tilt, his heartbeat shaking through his whole body. May pressed the wooden charm into his palm again. "Keep it on you. Don't let your house go silent, ever." Those words followed him home like a shadow. That night, Ethan filled the farmhouse with noise, playing music, running a white noise loop, letting the TV run endlessly. The constant hum comforted him, even though every window felt darker now, like something stood just outside the glow of the lamps. He tried to sleep, but woke after midnight to the thickest silence he had ever known. Not the quiet of a countryside night. This was deeper, heavier, suffocating. Every sound maker he'd turned on was dead. The power was out. He felt the pressure in the air shift. The house was too still. And then, "Ethan?" A whisper slid across the darkness from behind him. He spun, choking on fear, but nothing moved. The whisper returned, closer this time, as soft as breath. "Why did you stop listening?" He grabbed a metal flashlight and slammed it against the wall. The clang echoed hard and sharp. The whisper vanished instantly. In the far end of the hall, something tall and thin drew back into the shadows like a retreating spider. He hit the wall again and again, until finally the power flicked back on, and sound rushed into the house like oxygen into drowning lungs. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, he tried to leave Hollow Creek. He packed a bag and drove straight toward the road leading out of town. But just as he neared the welcome sign, a tall figure stepped onto the road, forcing him to slam the brakes. It didn't move. It didn't even turn its head. And when he blinked, it was gone. The woods fell completely silent. A whisper threaded through the trees. "Stay." His vision blurred, his hands shook. He threw the car in reverse and sped back towards town like a man fleeing fire. When he arrived on Main Street, several locals stared at him with grim understanding. One elderly man sweeping the sidewalk muttered, "No one leaves." Ethan realized then that everyone here lived with the same fear and had accepted the trap he now found himself in. That evening, Ethan returned to his house with a new plan: survival. He set up backup generators, candles, hand-crank radios, anything that could make noise without electricity.
But around midnight, while he sat guarding the house with a flashlight in one hand and a pan in the other, he noticed movement outside the window. A line of shapes stood at the tree line, dozens of them, tall, thin, and completely still, watching, waiting. One slowly raised its arm and pointed straight at him. The lights flickered, the radio crackled, the world went still. Ethan lunged for the generator, pulling the starter cord until it roared to life. Noise flooded the house, the figures froze, and then they dissolved back into the woods like shadows retreating from flame. But Ethan knew he wasn't repelling them anymore, he was only delaying them. Hours before sunrise, he realized he needed more help than May could give. He ran across town to her house, pounding on her door, shouting her name. The door creaked open on its own. Inside was dark, too dark, no lamps, no rustle of movement. May sat stiffly in her armchair facing the wall. Ethan approached hesitantly, calling her name again. She turned her head slowly, and he saw her eyes, glassy, unfocused, hollow. Her lips parted, and her voice came out in a thin, broken whisper that seemed to tremble against the air. "They're already here." Her gaze shifted past Ethan, toward the doorway behind him. He turned. The house was silent. Too silent. Something tall stood in the hallway, watching, waiting for him to stop breathing, waiting for him to fall quiet enough that they could take him too.
The storm outside ripped across the coastline as Detective Hale made his way back toward the old Baxter House, its silhouette trembling under the flickering sky. Something in him knew this night would not end quietly. When he stepped inside, the air felt wrong, too still, too heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. A faint echo of weeping drifted from the basement stairs, the same sound he had heard in the recordings. With a flashlight trembling in his hand, he descended the steps. The basement was colder than any winter he'd known. At the center of the room stood the same battered chair described by every witness, only now someone was sitting in it. A young woman, pale as moonlight, her long hair covering her face. Hale spoke her name, Emily Baxter, the missing girl the town had buried but never found. At the sound of her name, she lifted her head, revealing eyes that flickered like dying embers, begging not for help, but for release. Suddenly the room warped, folding into a memory not his own. Hale saw the truth. Emily wasn't possessed. She had been sacrificed by her own father, a pastor who believed he could drive out darkness by creating it. She had been trapped ever since, caught between breath and oblivion. Hale stumbled back as the house shuddered, the shadows pulling toward her like tides. Emily stood, her voice trembling as she thanked him. His presence, his refusal to run, had finally broken the chain of silence. Light, soft, warm, impossibly gentle, began to spread from her chest, filling the basement. The walls cracked, the house screamed, and Emily's figure dissolved like dust in sunrise. In a sweeping burst of light, the Baxter house collapsed behind Hale as he barely escaped into the rain-soaked yard. Where the house once stood was now only smoke and a hollow foundation, but also silence, peaceful for the first time in decades. Days later, Hale listened to the final audio recording found in his pocket, something he didn't remember taking. It was Emily's voice, clear, calm, free, saying, "Thank you for seeing me." Then it ended. Hale closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over him, knowing that some stories don't need evidence, only belief. And somewhere beyond the town, beyond the veil, the restless girl finally slept.